July 1944, Khorramshahr, Iran. The convoy of newly assembled Studebaker US-6 trucks stretches as far as Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison can see. 3 miles of olive-drab steel, each vehicle fresh from the assembly lines, engines still smelling of new grease and gasoline, exhaust pipes gleaming under the relentless sun. Behind him, the port facilities extend along the muddy banks of the Shat al-Arab, concrete wharves, massive cranes, assembly hangars the size of city blocks. The temperature reads 113 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. There is no shade. Morrison walks along the convoy, noting serial numbers in his logbook. 247 trucks in this batch alone. By tomorrow, Soviet drivers will take delivery and begin the 1,000-mile journey north through the Zagros Mountains. This is the 14th such convoy this month, the 28th this quarter. Since January 1943, nearly 200,000 vehicles have rolled through these assembly plants, built from nothing in the hottest, most desolate corner of the Persian Gulf. He pauses to inspect one truck more closely. The dashboard instruments are labeled in Cyrillic. The steering wheel sits on the left, American style, but the entire vehicle has been configured to Soviet specifications. Spare parts kits are secured in metal boxes behind the cab. Each truck carries enough tools and components for field repairs hundreds of miles from any depot. Morrison has watched this process evolve from chaotic improvisation to precise industrial choreography. What once took 3 days per vehicle now takes 8 hours. The assembly line workers, mostly Iranian laborers supervised by American sergeants, have become remarkably efficient despite language barriers and the punishing climate that makes metal tools too hot to hold by mid-morning. The colonel pauses at a warehouse entrance. Inside, crated locomotive components await assembly. Beyond that, another hangar houses A-20 Havoc bombers in various stages of preparation for Soviet pilots. The scale staggers him, even after 18 months of service here. This port, this entire logistical network didn't exist 3 years ago. Now it's feeding an entire front of the war. The statistics Morrison compiles each week tell a story the Axis powers never believed possible. More than 4 million tons of American and Allied war material flowing through Iran to the Soviet Union. A supply line Hitler dismissed as impractical. A lifeline Stalin called essential. How did American engineers transform medieval Iran into the arsenal of the Eastern Front? The answer lies in one of history's most remarkable engineering campaigns, and one of its least known. If you want to see how this impossible feat was accomplished, support us with a like. It helps us uncover more buried stories like this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Now let's explore how they did it. The journey to this industrial miracle began with desperation, not ambition. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa unleashed 3 million German soldiers across an 1,800-mile front into the Soviet Union. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht captured Minsk, encircled Smolensk, and drove toward Moscow and Leningrad. Soviet casualties mounted at catastrophic rates, hundreds of thousands killed, wounded, or captured in the war's opening months. Stalin's Red Army, reeling from the German onslaught and years of purges, faced annihilation. Britain, already fighting alone against Nazi Germany, immediately recognized the strategic imperative: keep the Soviet Union in the war. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, despite his lifelong antipathy toward communism, understood the mathematics of survival. On June 22, hours after learning of the invasion, he declared Britain's support for the Soviet cause. President Franklin Roosevelt, with the United States still technically neutral, quickly followed suit. The lend-lease program, signed into law in March 1941, would extend to the Soviet Union. The challenge became logistics. How do you supply an ally separated by thousands of miles of enemy-controlled territory and hostile ocean? The Allies developed multiple supply routes. The northern route through Arctic waters to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk offered the most direct path. Beginning in August 1941, convoys of merchant ships, protected by Royal Navy escorts, battled brutal Arctic conditions, German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers to deliver supplies to Soviet northern ports. PQ MQ-17, sailing in June 1942, lost 24 of 33 ships to coordinated German attacks. The Arctic route remained operational but exceptionally dangerous and limited by ice to certain months. The Pacific route through Vladivostok proved more reliable, but faced its own constraints. Soviet neutrality with Japan meant only Soviet-flagged vessels could use this route, limiting capacity. Geographic distance, cargo traveling from American West Coast ports across the Pacific, then via the Trans-Siberian Railway, created enormous time delays. This left the southern route, the Persian Corridor. On paper, it looked impossible. Ships would sail from American ports around Africa's Cape of Good Hope, a 12,000-mile voyage to the Persian Gulf. From there, supplies would transit Iran to the Soviet border via a single-track railroad through some of the world's most forbidding terrain, or by primitive roads that barely qualified as tracks. The infrastructure didn't exist. The political situation was volatile. The climate was murderous. But geography made it unavoidable. Iran shared a 1,200-mile border with the Soviet Union. The Trans-Iranian Railway, completed in 1938, connected the Persian Gulf to the Caspian Sea, theoretically. And critically, Iran could operate year-round, unlike the frozen northern ports. August 25, 1941, British and Soviet forces invaded Iran in Operation Countenance. The ostensible reason, Reza Shah Pahlavi's refusal to expel German nationals and perceived Axis sympathies. The real reason, immediate control of the Trans-Iranian Railway and Iranian oil fields. Within 3 days, Allied forces occupied all strategic positions. Reza Shah abdicated in favor of his 21-year-old son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. Iran became, effectively, occupied territory divided between British and Soviet zones of control. The British Royal Engineers immediately began assessing the southern railway section from the Persian Gulf ports to Tehran. What they discovered horrified them. The Trans-Iranian Railway could move exactly 1 freight train per day. Total daily capacity, 978 tons. To put this in perspective, a single Liberty ship carried approximately 10,000 tons of cargo. At existing capacity, unloading 1 ship would take 10 days, and the Allies needed to move thousands of ships' worth of supplies. The primary ports presented equally severe limitations. Khorramshahr, situated at the confluence of the Karun River and Shat al-Arab waterway, possessed minimal facilities, a few basic wharves built for commercial traffic, no heavy cargo handling equipment, no storage infrastructure. Bandar Shapur, 50 miles to the southwest on the Persian Gulf proper, had 1 2-berth jetty built in 1941. Neither port could handle military cargo at scale. The road network consisted of camel tracks and ancient caravan routes. The climate alternated between months of crushing heat, temperatures routinely exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and winter rains that turned the landscape into impassable mud. Disease was endemic. Malaria, dysentery, and heat casualties would kill more Allied personnel than enemy action in this theater. Nevertheless, in September 1941, the United States military Iranian mission arrived, led by Colonel Raymond A. Wheeler of the Army Corps of Engineers. Wheeler's initial assessment to Washington was blunt. Developing adequate capacity would require unprecedented construction efforts, massive equipment shipments, and thousands of skilled personnel. The timeline? Years. The Soviets didn't have years. By December 1941, German forces stood 20 miles from Moscow. The Red Army desperately needed trucks, tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, fuel, everything required to sustain combat operations against the Wehrmacht's war machine. The Allies had no choice. They would build the impossible supply line. Through late 1941 and into 1942, the British Royal Engineers began expansion efforts with available resources. They imported steam locomotives. 27 coal-burning LMS 280s arrived by February 1942, followed by 96 oil-burning locomotives by August, each requiring extensive testing and modification. They constructed new railway yards at Bandar Shapur, Awaz, and Andameshk. They built a junction at Awaz for a new 75-mile branch line connecting to Khorramshahr, completed in June 1942. They established a transfer yard at Abadan to offload locomotives from merchant ships onto barges, which traveled up the Karun River to Awaz, where derricks lifted them onto tracks. The work proceeded under increasingly difficult conditions. British personnel, stretched thin across global commitments from North Africa to Burma, could spare only limited manpower for Iran. Equipment arrived sporadically. Construction materials competed with urgent military priorities elsewhere. The climate proved even more challenging than anticipated. Summer temperatures regularly exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing work to halt during midday hours. Winter brought torrential rains that turned construction sites into impassable quagmires. Disease ravaged work crews. Malaria, dysentery, and typhoid fever hospitalized hundreds. Medical facilities were inadequate. Supply lines for basic necessities like potable water and food remained tenuous. Despite heroic efforts by British engineers and growing numbers of Iranian laborers, progress came incrementally. By summer 1942, the railway's daily capacity had increased to approximately 2,500 tons, better but still grossly insufficient. Meanwhile, the war situation deteriorated catastrophically. German summer offensive operations in 1942 drove deep into Soviet territory. The Wehrmacht captured Sevastopol in July, crossed the Don River in August, and pushed toward the Caucasus oil fields and Stalingrad. Simultaneously, the Arctic convoy route became untenable. In March 1942, convoy PQ-13 lost 5 of 19 ships. PQ-17 in June-July lost 24 of 33 ships, the worst convoy disaster of the war. In September, only 40% of PQ-18's cargo reached Soviet ports. On July 4, 1942, the British Admiralty suspended Arctic convoys entirely until the return of winter darkness. The Persian corridor suddenly transformed from supplementary route to primary lifeline. The Second Protocol commitments, agreements made in October 1941 promising the Soviet Union specific quantities of war material, specified delivery of 1 million tons via the Persian Gulf route by June 30, 1943. Under British operation, this target was impossible. Ships began backing up in the Persian Gulf, waiting weeks for berths. Ports became glutted with undischarged cargo. The railway couldn't clear what did get unloaded. By January 1943, the War Shipping Administration estimated 28 vessels were idle in the Persian Gulf area, carrying 165,000 tons of undischarged cargo. Every day those ships sat represented critical supplies not reaching Soviet forces and ships desperately needed elsewhere. The British, overextended by global commitments and the crisis in India, couldn't provide the resources needed. They formally requested American assistance. On July 16, 1942, President Roosevelt decided the United States Army would assume responsibility for Persian corridor operations. It would be, in the understated language of military planning documents, an expansion of Iranian transportation facilities. What followed was anything but understated. The scale of American intervention would dwarf anything the British had attempted. Where the British had measured progress in dozens of locomotives and hundreds of workers, the Americans planned in terms of thousands of troops, thousands of vehicles, thousands of tons of equipment. The transformation would require not just construction, but wholesale industrial transplantation. Entire American port facilities would be recreated in the Persian Gulf. Assembly lines that belonged in Detroit would operate in the Iranian desert. Railway yards that could serve a major American city would spring up in locations that barely appeared on maps. The psychological shift was equally profound. The British had approached Iran as an extension of their Middle Eastern colonial operations, working within existing limitations, adapting to local conditions, making do with available resources. The Americans would approach it as an engineering problem to be solved through application of overwhelming industrial power. If water was scarce, they would install desalination equipment. If heat made daytime work impossible, they would install lighting and work at night. If local infrastructure was inadequate, they would build their own from scratch. If traditional construction methods failed in extreme temperatures, they would invent new ones. This wasn't adaptation, this was transformation. The British had tried to work with Iran. The Americans would remake it. August 1942. The planning began in earnest at Services of Supply headquarters in Washington. The mission parameters were clear but daunting. The U.S. Army needed to increase the Persian corridor's capacity from roughly 2,500 tons daily to at least 10,000 tons daily, a four-fold increase. This required 1. Building or expanding port facilities capable of rapidly unloading dozens of ships simultaneously, handling everything from bulk cargo to assembled locomotives weighing 40 tons. 2. Increasing the Trans-Iranian Railway's capacity tenfold through hundreds of miles of mountainous terrain with 144 tunnels and grades approaching 3%. 3. Constructing an entirely new motor transport system capable of moving thousands of tons daily over routes that didn't exist. 4. Establishing assembly plants to build vehicles and aircraft on site rather than shipping them fully assembled, reducing shipping space requirements. All of this in a climate that would challenge the hardiest construction crews, with supply lines stretching 12,000 miles from American ports. The Services of Supply Plan, finalized in August 1942, called for massive deployments. Equipment requirements included 75 steam locomotives, 2,200 railway freight cars, 7,200 trucks, and extensive cargo handling equipment. Personnel requirements included railway operating battalions, port battalions, truck regiments, engineer units, ordnance companies, signal battalions, military police, and medical units. Total projected strength, approximately 30,000 troops. The plan had one critical flaw. 7-ton trucks didn't exist in American production. The planners improvised, substituting 2.5-ton trucks with 1-ton trailers. Similarly, on the recommendation of railroad expert W. Averill Harriman, 57 Alco diesel locomotives replaced the planned steam locomotives. Diesels proved far more suitable for Iran's limited water supplies, extreme heat, and tunnel-filled routes. August 1942, the mission was redesignated the Persian Gulf Service Command, PGSC. Colonel Donald Shingler assumed command. October 20, 1942, Brigadier General Donald H. Connolly took over as commanding general. Born in Arizona in 1886, Connolly graduated from West Point in 1910 as an engineer officer. He brought extensive civil engineering experience, having served as officer in charge of the Works Progress Administration in Southern California from 1935 to 1939. He understood large-scale construction projects, civilian workforce management, and the politics of resource allocation. He would need all of it. December 11th to 12th, 1942. The first major troop deployment arrived at Khorramshahr, 5,430 soldiers disembarking from transport ships into the Persian Gulf heat. Many had trained in temperate climates and were utterly unprepared for Iran. They slept in tents pitched in mud during the winter rainy season, waiting months for permanent structures. When summer arrived, temperatures soared above 110 degrees Fahrenheit. Sandstorms lasting days buried equipment and obscured visibility to zero. Dust infiltrated everything: engines, weapons, food, lungs. The troops discovered they were building an industrial city from essentially nothing. The reality exceeded even the ambitious planning documents. What looked manageable on paper in Washington became brutally tangible in Iran. The heat didn't just slow work, it created cascading problems that planners had never anticipated. Asphalt melted in storage, paint blistered off equipment before application, rubber gaskets degraded within weeks, metal hand tools became instruments of torture capable of causing second-degree burns from brief contact. Workers learned to wrap tool handles in cloth or wait until twilight to handle equipment. Concrete curing required constant water application in temperatures that evaporated moisture within minutes. The human cost of adaptation was immediate and severe. In the first 6 months of American operations, heat casualties exceeded combat casualties in many Pacific Theater units. Men collapsed during routine work. Dehydration hospitalized dozens weekly. The medical facilities, designed for typical military operations, found themselves treating conditions more common in extreme survival situations. Doctors requisitioned additional salt tablets, intravenous fluid supplies, and cooling equipment on scales that surprised even experienced military physicians. Yet the work continued. Orders were orders. The Soviets were dying. Every day of delay meant Soviet soldiers fighting without ammunition, without food, without the trucks they desperately needed. The troops in Iran understood this mathematics. They might be thousands of miles from any front line, but their mission was just as critical. They would build the impossible supply line, regardless of cost. General Connolly's philosophy was pragmatic. Speed trumped perfection, and local adaptation trumped rigid adherence to standard procedures. The Persian Gulf Command needed to deliver tonnage immediately. Every week of delay meant Soviet forces fighting without adequate supplies. The port construction strategy focused on rapid expansion using concrete construction despite the challenging climate. At Khorramshahr, engineers found existing facilities catastrophically inadequate. 4 berths at Sentab Jetty plus 2 under construction, 1,000-foot lighterage wharf on Filea Creek equipped with a single 100-ton crane requisitioned from Awaz. American engineer troops and Iranian laborers immediately began extending the Filea Creek wharf by 600 feet, installing lighting systems, and reconstructing Kumba Wharf to handle crated vehicles and equipment. The concrete presented unique challenges. Standard construction techniques required concrete to cure slowly in controlled temperatures. Iranian summer heat caused rapid curing with potential structural failures. Engineers developed modified concrete mixes with specific water-to-cement ratios and additives to maintain workability in extreme heat. They constructed forms with cooling systems and utilized continuous water curing to prevent premature setting. Construction proceeded around the clock. Work crews operated in shifts to maximize cooler night hours while maintaining continuous progress. Bandar Shah Pur's expansion proved even more ambitious. British construction of a second jetty, begun in 1942, progressed slowly. American forces accelerated the timeline while simultaneously developing inland storage facilities. The port's isolation, no nearby town, minimal existing infrastructure, meant building everything from scratch. Warehouses, maintenance facilities, rail yards, roads, worker housing, medical facilities, and power generation. The railway capacity increase depended on multiple factors. The 57 ALCO RSD-1 diesel-electric locomotives proved transformative. Rated at 1,000 horsepower each with COCO wheel arrangements, they handled the steep grades and extensive tunnels far better than steam locomotives. The limited water availability throughout the route, a critical constraint for steam operations, became irrelevant. Heat and tunnel smoke that would incapacitate steam locomotive crews barely affected diesel operations. Beyond locomotives, capacity required rolling stock. The 1,650 freight cars specified in the final plan provided equivalent total tonnage to the originally planned 2,200 20-ton cars, but with greater operational flexibility. Railway yards at key junctions, Bandar Shahpur, Khorramshahr, Avaz, Andameshk, and Tehran required expansion to handle increased traffic. Signaling systems needed upgrades. Maintenance facilities required construction to service the expanded fleet. The motor transport service represented a separate massive undertaking. The plan called for truck convoys operating continuously between Andameshk and points north, supplementing railway capacity. The routes used ancient caravan tracks, requiring complete reconstruction. Engineers surveyed, graded, and constructed hundreds of miles of roads capable of handling loaded trucks. They established fuel depots, maintenance facilities, and driver rest stations at regular intervals. The Motor Transport Service, activated March 1, 1943, ultimately operated over 7,000 trucks, driving more than 97 million miles under brutal conditions. Perhaps most innovative were the assembly plant operations. Shipping fully assembled vehicles was inefficient. Trucks took enormous cargo space. The solution? Ship components and assemble on-site. General Motors Overseas Corporation initially operated plants at Andameshk beginning March 1942 and Khorramshahr beginning January 1943. The U.S. Army assumed direct operation on July 1, 1943, retaining thousands of Iranian workers. These plants assembled approximately 184,000 vehicles before closing in 1944 as the war situation shifted. The vast majority were Studebaker US-6 2.5-ton 6x6 trucks. Designed specifically for lend-lease export, these rugged vehicles featured Hercules JXD inline-6 engines, producing 86 horsepower, Warner T93 5-speed transmissions, enclosed cabs suitable for harsh climates. They could carry 2.5-ton loads off-road or up to 5 tons on improved roads. The Soviets loved them. Reliable, capable of running on poor-quality fuel, and mechanically simple. They nicknamed them Studers. Joseph Stalin himself sent a letter to Studebaker praising the truck's quality. Soviet forces converted thousands into Katyusha rocket launcher platforms, mounting multiple rocket rails on reinforced beds. Aircraft assembly operated separately. Douglas Aircraft Corporation contracted to operate an assembly plant at Abadan, near the world's largest oil refinery. British Royal Air Force initially began small-scale assembly. American operations expanded dramatically when the full plant opened. Soviet pilots flew in, picked up A-20 Havoc bombers and other aircraft, and flew them north into Soviet territory. The assembly plant eliminated the need to fly aircraft across the Atlantic or ship them in crates, significantly increasing throughput. Every element required workforce development. The British mandate that local economies not be disrupted meant wages remained absurdly low, 1 cent per day for laborers, 10 cents for technicians. Turnover was high. Pilferage was constant. American commanders repeatedly attempted to raise wages or offer bonuses. The British colonial government consistently refused. Despite these constraints, tens of thousands of Iranian workers provided essential labor for construction and operations. The design philosophy emerged clearly. Build adequate facilities fast using available resources and local labor. Prioritize throughput over perfection. Improvise solutions to unexpected problems and maintain operations under any conditions. It worked. January 7, 1943. American port personnel assumed full control of Khorramshahr operations. Bandar Shahpur followed in February. The transformation was immediate and dramatic. January 1943, railway delivered 51,000 tons to Soviet forces. By September 1943, railway capacity reached 5,400 tons daily, over 160,000 tons monthly. The tenfold increase from early 1942 was achieved. July 1944, single-month peak tonnage of 282,097 tons moved through the Persian corridor. The statistics accumulated relentlessly. Between American assumption of operations in late 1942 and the end of 1944, the Persian Gulf Command delivered approximately 2.7 million tons of supplies to the Soviet Union. Including tonnage delivered under British operation and other Allied contributions, the total through the Persian corridor exceeded 4.1 million tons, roughly 45% of all lend-lease aid reaching the Soviet Union. The human toll of maintaining operations was significant, though casualties resulted primarily from disease and accidents rather than combat. Malaria infected thousands despite aggressive preventive measures. Dysentery swept through camps regularly. Heat casualties mounted during summer months. Heat exhaustion, heat stroke, and heat-related cardiac events. Truck accidents on primitive mountain roads killed drivers. Railway accidents claimed lives. The Persian Gulf Command lost more personnel to environmental factors than many combat commands lost to enemy action. The work remained grinding and monotonous. Soldiers unloaded ships in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees. They assembled vehicles in unventilated hangars. They drove trucks through sandstorms that lasted days. They serviced locomotives in rail yards where metal surfaces became too hot to touch. They constructed facilities in rain-soaked winter mud. Entertainment was minimal, mail delivery sporadic, leaves rare. It was, in the words of soldiers who served there, the forgotten theater. No glory, no recognition, just endless logistics work in the world's least hospitable climate. Yet the tonnage flowed. Month after month, year after year, the supply line operated with increasing efficiency. Studebaker trucks, assembled in Khorramshahr and Andamashq, rolled north by the thousands. ALCO locomotives pulled freight trains through the Zagros Mountains. Supplies accumulated at Soviet border collection points. Grain, canned meat, medical supplies, ammunition, fuel, aircraft components, communications equipment, artillery pieces, raw materials, boots, uniforms, everything an army needed to fight. The impact on the Eastern Front was profound. In 1941–42, Soviet forces fought with whatever they possessed, plus minimal aid from struggling Arctic convoys. By late 1943, American trucks provided mobility Soviet logistics had never achieved. Soviet tank and aircraft production benefited from American raw materials delivered through Iran. Soviet soldiers wore boots manufactured in the United States. Soviet forces ate American canned goods. The Red Army's ability to conduct the massive offensive operations that characterized 1943 to 1945, operations that systematically destroyed the Wehrmacht, depended substantially on supplies delivered through the Persian corridor. The Germans never fully understood this. German intelligence identified the Persian corridor, but consistently underestimated its capacity. They recognized the Trans-Iranian Railway existed, but assumed its limitations made it militarily insignificant. They noted American construction activity in Iran, but failed to grasp the scale. German planning documents from 1942–43 mentioned the southern supply route only in passing, focusing instead on Arctic convoy interdiction. This intelligence failure cost them dearly. November 28, December 1, 1943. The Tehran Conference brought together Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin to coordinate Allied strategy. The Persian Gulf Command provided security, working alongside British and Soviet forces. The fact that the conference occurred in Tehran, supplied and secured through the very logistics network the conference partially discussed, demonstrated the system's success. Stalin explicitly thanked the Americans for the supply line's contribution to Soviet war efforts. By 1944, the mission was approaching completion. German forces were being driven westward across the Soviet Union. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June opened the Western Front, and Mediterranean ports became available for shipping to Soviet Black Sea ports. The Persian corridor's critical importance diminished as alternative routes became available, and the war moved toward conclusion. General George C. Marshall declared the Persian Gulf Command's mission accomplished on June 1, 1945. Unit deactivation began. Responsibility for railway operations returned to the British in June 1945. Port operations transferred in July. The command was redesignated the Persian Gulf Service Command in October 1945 and placed under the Africa-Middle East Theater. On December 26, 1945, the last American troops departed Khorramshahr. The final statistics tell the story of industrial achievement on a scale rarely matched. Total tonnage delivered to Soviet Union via Persian corridor, 4,159,117 long tons of cargo, representing approximately 45% of all American lend-lease aid to the Soviet Union. Railway operations, approximately 2.1 million tons transported by rail. Daily capacity increased from 978 tons first quarter 1942 to 5,400 tons September 1943 to peak capacity exceeding 6,400 tons 1944. Motor transport operations, over 97 million miles driven by American truck units, moving hundreds of thousands of tons supplementing rail capacity. Vehicles assembled and delivered, approximately 184,000 trucks and military vehicles, predominantly Studebaker U.S. trucks that became the workhorse of Soviet logistics. An additional 8,000 vehicles were driven directly to Soviet forces without assembly. Aircraft delivered. Nearly 5,000 aircraft assembled at Abadan and transferred to Soviet pilots. Locomotives and rolling stock. 57 Alco RSD-1 diesel locomotives, plus additional steam locomotives, and approximately 3,000 pieces of rolling stock of various types supplied to expand railway capacity. Personnel. Peak strength of approximately 30,000 American military personnel, plus tens of thousands of Iranian civilian workers. Casualties. Exact figures are incomplete, but several hundred American personnel died from disease, accidents, and heat-related causes. Iranian civilian casualties from workplace accidents and disease were higher but poorly documented. Construction achievements. Multiple expanded port facilities with dozens of berths and extensive cargo handling equipment. Hundreds of miles of reconstructed roads. Multiple assembly plants capable of producing thousands of vehicles monthly. Railway yards, maintenance facilities, fuel depots, housing for tens of thousands, power generation facilities, communications infrastructure. The comparison with other lend-lease routes illuminates the Persian corridor's significance. The Arctic route delivered approximately 3.9 million tons, despite operating only during months when ice conditions permitted and facing continuous Axis attacks. The Pacific route through Vladivostok delivered approximately 8.2 million tons, but faced severe time delays, cargo traveling from American West Coast to Soviet Far East, then via Trans-Siberian Railway to European Russia. The Persian corridor, operating year-round with increasing efficiency, became the reliable backbone of Soviet supply. The economic cost was substantial. Exact figures remain classified or dispersed across multiple accounting systems, but estimates suggest the United States invested several $100 million in Persian Gulf Command operations, construction, equipment, personnel, and operational costs. This excluded the value of supplies delivered, which totaled billions. The strategic cost to the Axis was incalculable. Every ton delivered through Iran represented materials used against German forces on the Eastern Front. The Soviet Union's ability to sustain operations through 1942 to 43, the war's most desperate period, depended significantly on this supply line. German failure to interdict or even accurately assess the Persian corridor contributed directly to Wehrmacht defeat in the East. Perhaps most remarkably, the entire operation was conducted without significant combat operations. The Persian Gulf Command faced no organized military opposition. German forces never reached Iran. German intelligence never mounted successful sabotage operations against the corridor. The enemy was climate, disease, logistics, and the engineering challenge itself. This absence of combat paradoxically made the achievement more remarkable, not less. Military forces are designed for combat. Soldiers train for years to face enemy fire. The entire military-industrial complex exists to support combat operations. But in Iran, that entire apparatus was directed toward pure construction and logistics, the unglamorous foundation of modern warfare that rarely earns recognition or glory. The troops who served in the Persian Gulf Command received no campaign medals for combat. They participated in no famous battles. Their names appear in no dramatic histories of the war, yet their contribution to Allied victory was measurable, quantifiable, and ultimately decisive. The 4.1 million tons they delivered represented approximately 16% of all lend-lease aid to the Soviet Union, aid that reached Soviet forces when they needed it most through a supply line that operated with increasing efficiency even as other routes faced crisis after crisis. The Persian Gulf Command proved that modern war is won not just by soldiers who fight, but by soldiers who build, who maintain, who transport, who enable. Victory belongs to those willing to endure not just enemy fire, but extreme heat, disease, isolation, and monotonous labor, day after day, month after month, until the job is done. July 1944, Khorramshahr, Iran. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison completes his inspection of the convoy, closes his logbook, and walks back toward the Port Administration Building through the brutal afternoon heat. The statistics he records will eventually reach Washington, contributing to the comprehensive accounting of lend-lease deliveries. But standing here, watching Soviet drivers accept vehicle after vehicle, Morrison understands something the numbers alone cannot capture. This port, these assembly plants, these concrete wharves, these railway yards represents American industrial and engineering capability deployed at scale in the most unlikely location imaginable. 3 years ago, Khorramshahr was a backwater river port with minimal facilities. Now it's an industrial complex rivaling any in the United States, operating continuously under conditions that would shut down factories anywhere else. The Persian Gulf Command proved a fundamental principle of modern warfare: logistics wins wars. The Soviet Union's remarkable recovery from the catastrophic losses of 1941–42 was not solely due to Soviet courage, sacrifice, and industrial production. It depended substantially on American trucks carrying supplies, American locomotives pulling freight, American food feeding soldiers, American raw materials feeding factories, all delivered through a supply line built from nothing in the Iranian desert. The Germans dismissed this route as impractical. They were catastrophically wrong. By the time German intelligence fully grasped the Persian corridor's capacity, Soviet forces were driving westward toward Berlin in American trucks supplied by a lifeline the Nazis never successfully interdicted. The irony cuts deep. Nazi propaganda emphasized German engineering prowess and Aryan superiority. German industry produced formidable weapons. German logistics supported the Wehrmacht's dramatic conquests of 1939–1942. Yet Germany never conceived of, much less executed, anything approaching the Persian Gulf Command's achievement. They couldn't imagine building a major industrial port and supply system in the world's harshest environment solely to supply an ally thousands of miles away. American engineers could imagine it, and they built it. The lesson extends beyond World War II. The Persian Gulf Command established principles that governed American military operations for the next 80 years, the understanding that wars are won or lost based on logistics. The recognition that engineering and construction units are as critical as combat units, the knowledge that industrial capacity, properly applied, becomes a decisive strategic weapon. The Korean War, Vietnam, Desert Storm, the global war on terror all relied on these principles, first proven in Iran. When the last American troops departed Khorramshahr on December 26, 1945, they left behind facilities that Iran would use for decades: the expanded ports, the railway improvements, the roads, the physical infrastructure remained. But more significantly, they left proof that American engineering, ingenuity, and industrial power could overcome any obstacle when properly motivated and resourced. The examination of the Persian corridor reveals what truly defeated the Axis powers: not merely military valor, though that was essential, not merely industrial production, though that was critical, but the ability to project that industrial power globally, to build the impossible supply lines, to sustain operations under any conditions, to think in terms of systems rather than merely weapons. The Persian Gulf Command was not America's most glamorous World War II achievement. It was, however, one of the most consequential. The statistics: 4.1 million tons, 184,000 vehicles, 97 million miles, 5,000 aircraft, represent something more fundamental than logistics. They represent the American way of war: overwhelming industrial power applied with engineering precision to solve strategic problems. The supply line that Hitler dismissed as impossible became the lifeline that helped strangle his empire. And it was built in the last place anyone expected: the scorching wasteland of the Persian Gulf. That single fact reveals the entire story of why the Axis powers lost the war. They underestimated their enemy's willingness to do the difficult, unsexy work of logistics. They assumed geographic and climatic barriers were insurmountable. They believed their technical superiority would overcome Allied material advantages. They were wrong on all counts. The concrete wharves of Khorramshahr, baking under the Iranian sun, stand as silent testimony to that fatal miscalculation.